So, now we are going to proceed with the next panel, which is entitled The Coloniality of the European City. I'm very happy that this panel is taking place, and I'm very much looking forward to listen to your contributions. The panel will be moderated by Cengiz Barskanmaz, and he's a legal scholar with a special focus on critical race theory. And currently he's finalizing his PhD project about law against racism toward a suitable understanding of racism. And his research fields include constitutional and non-discrimination law and human rights, critical race theory, post-colonialism, and intersectionality. His latest publication concerns the use of the concept race in the German basic law, as well as the ideological construction called the German exceptionalism. That's okay? He's also a founding member of the critical race theory in Europe. In his function as a consultant for the Open Society Justice Initiative, he is working on ethnic segregation in the educational system in Berlin, and Cengiz is a committed transnational anti-racist activist with focus on the Kurdish and the Palestinian question. And he just recently organized a great conference on critical race theory. So, it's your floor.
Thank you very much, Noah. Thank you very much for having me here as the moderator of this panel. I think you already gave an introduction to the panel. I would like to go straight forward and start actually with the panel without wasting some time. Let me just briefly introduce you my first speaker, Manuela. All the speakers, I don't know why they insisted on keeping this part very short. I think you should enjoy this part when people, when the moderator or other people really present or make your work public. I think there is nothing to be ashamed of. So I'm gonna actually do whatever I do think, because I think you do a lot of exacting work and it would be a shame not to mention it. So Manuela Boatca is professor of sociology at the Free University of Berlin. She studied English and German philology at the universities of Bucharest, Bonn, and Cologne, and sociology at the Catholic University of Eichstätt. Also my education at the Catholic University, by the way. Interesting. She was also in Brazil. Her research interests include world systems analysis, sociology of development, gender and violence research, and post-colonial studies in historical comparative perspective, with a regional focus on Eastern Europe and Latin America. She's author of From Neo-Evolutionism to World Systems Analysis, the Romanian Theory of Forms Without Substance, in Light Modern Debates on Social Change, 2003, and she is the co-editor of Decolonizing European Sociology. Manuela, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you so much to the organizers for having me here, and thank you, Cengiz, for the generous introduction. I'm going to speak from here. I like to hold on to things when I speak, so I hope nobody sees it as a position of authority. This is not how it's meant. I'm going to go back to an issue that sounds very much like it deserves the criticism we heard before. Germany is very academic, and it sticks to academic issues, because it's going to be somewhat theoretical in the beginning, but I think since we're in a conference on decolonizing the city, we should also take a maybe quick look back and think about where do some of the things that we want to do away with actually come from. And that's why I'm going to focus on the Orientalist constructions of otherness in Max Weber's Sociology of Citizenship. Now, it sounds more theoretical than it is, but bear with me for a while. I think the most telling part of the title is
the part that does not belong to me, but is a quote from Weber, city air makes free. Now, Max Weber has been considered one of the key urban sociologists, but he was not actually very much concerned with the city as such, or having a sociology of the city, but much more with proving the uniqueness of the West, and of showing how much the rationality characterizing Western civilization as a whole was what made the West unique. And you've heard a little bit about the uniqueness in Ella Schwartz's talk this morning. Uniqueness is about nothing else matters, right? As you said. So there's a lot of that in Weber, and a lot of what he understood the West to be and what made the Western city unique for him is part and parcel of the central problems that we have to deal with in mainstream urban sociology today. Now, one of the things that Weber made clear, and it was not on any part of the city, but it was in his sociology of religion, was that rational science, for instance, was unique to the West. And so was any kind of rational technique in art, literature, music, architecture. The use of linear techniques were rational and were not there anywhere else, despite any kinds of other scientific or artistic advances in Islamic context, in Chinese historiography, in Babylonian astronomy, in Indian medicine. Everything for him has never been as rational and as systematic as in the West. So for him, rational science was unique to the West and could actually be traced back to the Hellenic mind, that is, to ancient Greece. Now, for him, only what he called rudimentary developments of the state as a political institution, operating also on a basis of, quote, a rationally enacted constitution and rationally enacted laws, unquote, had crystallized outside the West. These distinguishing features now characterize the modern state only in the West, so that could not be for him in any way overstated. You could not repeat it often enough. For him, one of the quotes from the sociology of religion is, "Only the Occident knows the state in the modern sense, with a constitution, specialized officialdom, and the concept of citizenship. Beginnings of this institution in antiquity and in the Orient were never able to develop fully. Only the Occident knows rational law made by jurists and rationally interpreted and planned, and only in the Occident is found the concept of citizen, civis Romanus, citoyen, bourgeois, because only in the West, only in the Occident, does the city exist in the specific sense of the word." Now this is so rhythmic, you can almost make a song out of it, right? And a rap song would probably be good. But against the background of such a blatant Orientalist statement, I want to focus on a few things. I would like to argue that Weber's contribution to urban sociology more generally, and to the sociology of citizenship in particular, is paradigmatic for Occidentalist understandings of European and non-European cities, because this had spread out as being the wisdom on the city, and ultimately it is paradigmatic for the coloniality of citizenship. And I'm going to look at this in two steps. First, at the issue of Orientalism as such, and then go back to the issue that is broader and less theoretical of citizenship and inequality. Now, especially in his section on the city, in economy and society, but also at various points in his sociology of religion, Weber had clearly traced the rise of citizenship as an institutionalized association of an autonomous status group, so as a Stand, of individual burghers subject to the same law, back to the ancient Greek polis and the medieval Occidental city. Now for him, what was revolutionary, the revolutionary innovation differentiating the Central and Northern European cities from all others, had been the principle that city air makes man free. Meaning that whoever came to the city as a slave or a serf would soon afterwards gain freedom from their masters on account of being in the city. So city makes you free by definition. Consequently then, in time, status differences between free and unfree city dwellers gave way to the equality of individual citizens before the law. So that's the origin of the idea of citizenship. Now, This was characteristic of medieval Occidental cities, but antecedents could be found in Greece and Rome, but also Near East and Russia. But according to Weber, the possibility of becoming free not only intensified the economic effort of unfree petty burghers, but also constituted a preliminary stage in the achievement of political equality. And he's saying, the Occidental city thus was already in antiquity, just like in Russia, a place where the ascent from bondage to freedom by means of monetary acquisition was possible. So you could also buy your freedom, but the idea was you could achieve it. This is even more true for the medieval city, and especially for the medieval inland city, in contrast to all urban developments elsewhere. The burghers of the Occidental city engaged in status-conscious policies directed toward that goal. So that means, clearly, Weber has a model on which he operates that is definitely the West versus the rest. Regardless of whatever achievements were out there in any part of the world, in big Asian cities, in big empires of the pre-modern world, you only had this strive towards equality in an Occidental city that had developed out of European feudalism. Now, it's actually an easy task to see, on the basis of such statements, that Weber was an Orientalist. And I would be not the first person to say that, because Orientalism has been criticized by a lot of people, but also it has been kind of played down by people such as Brian Turner, who say, well, but everybody was an Orientalist in Weber's time, so, what could he do? Now, other people, again, like George Steinmetz, have shown that in his writings on China, Weber was part of the most xenophobic, xenophobic of his time. There were several factions of Orientalists in his time, but only Weber chose to say that China was not a place where development was possible, that China was not a place that had systematic scientific science, and that had a different kind of rationality. Now, it was Engin Işık who has shown that in the context of the sociology of citizenship, it was that Weber drew what Işık has called sharper and sharper distinctions between Occidental and Oriental cities, and in the process provided a unified and homogeneous account of both. Citizenship became both the embodiment and the expression of the uniqueness of the Occidental city. And that's Engin Işık on Weber and citizenship. Now, in Weber's view, the fully developed ancient and medieval city of the West was first and foremost a sworn confraternity of individual burghers, again, individual. Full membership in the ecclesiastic community, meaning in the Christian church, was the prerequisite of urban citizenship. So, mind you, it was not just the West, it was not just the medieval Western city, it was Christianity that made it possible for citizenship to appear as an institution of the modern world. And then he goes on and on about how different kinds of institutions grew out of medieval Occidental cities. They said the Cid, kind of clan, had been deprived of all ritual significance by Christianity, for by its very nature, religion having a nature, the Christian congregation was a religious association of individual believers, not a ritual association of clans. And then he goes on to call this the hour of conception of Occidental citizenry. Because he's saying the minute the Christian religion has been deprived of ritual significance is the minute that all ritual barriers of birth have been eliminated from social life, which for him is something that happens back at Antioch, when Peter has a communal meal with uncircumcised proselytes, right? Okay, this is like very theological, very historical. What does it mean? What he means is the birth of Occidental citizenship occurred much later than the birth of Christianity. The founding moment of the institution of citizenship was the first person who founded a religion on community of believers across blood ties, ethnic differences, racial differences, and different religious understandings. And he's saying, without commensalism, shared meals, right, eating together, in Christian terms, without the Lord's Supper, no oath-bound fraternity and no medieval urban citizenry would have been possible. So, have here the founding moment of Occidental citizenship for Weber, which is the Lord's Supper. Now, excuse me for choosing Da Vinci's depiction of that, where Jesus is already blonde and blue-eyed, so he has been de-racialized already, but that's actually what is being meant. It's a community across all kinds of ascribed characteristics. It is a community of believers. So for him, it was the abstraction and transcendence of Western religious theology that allowed for the establishment of a solitary religious community over and against narrow ties of blood or economic status. Now, against that, for him, Hinduism had caste. Having an all-pervasive caste system made this a status order with religious beliefs that ensured that it was an ascribed status. You were born into a caste and stayed into that caste. It was irrespective of individual qualifications, and it was inherited from one generation to the other. So for him, Hinduism is by definition a religion where, rather than being in principle equal, men were forever unequal. And of course, there's no talk of women, but there's no idea of equality, there's no striving for equality, there's only being forever unequal. In the case of Judaism, it was also the ritual exclusion of intermarriage. It was Jews and non-Jews in medieval cities did not interact with each other, so exclusion from developing burgher associations. Okay. Now, the idea is, despite acknowledging the similarities between all other aspects of city formation in the West, on the one hand, and Chinese, Indian, Japanese, Near Eastern urban settlements on the other, Weber's comparative studies repeatedly concluded that ritual obstacles to confraternization, to eating together, intermarrying, had accounted for the divergence between East and West in the long run. Now, this, of course, easily glosses over the fact that clans and tribes did not disappear in the Occidental city, nor kinship and magic ties, which he attributed to Hinduism and other types of very backward religions. He didn't use the word backward, but he was applying it. But at the same time, the fact that he sees the Occidental city as different from the Occidental West on account of it being Christian makes his principle of city air made free carry an additional meaning. And the additional meaning is having a sequence of social change which, as it progressed from bondage to freedom, gradually abandoned all kinds of ascribed criteria of social stratification in favor of achieved characteristics. So you have an ideal typical transition from tradition to modernity, where from ascribed types of caste, status, and religious differentiation, you get to achieved position. You can buy your freedom and then do whatever you want with your life. Because for him, the intended meaning and purpose of the Sinn of citizenship is to create a certain counterbalance to the social inequalities, which are neither rooted in natural differences nor created by natural qualities, but are produced rather by social conditions. The inequality of the outer circumstances of life, particularly of property, can never be eliminated altogether. So institutionalizing citizenship for him was, okay, we can't do away with all inequalities, but we can institute political equality. And all citizens can be equal. This is only something that has happened in the West. Now, this goes on and on through the sociology of T.H. Marshall's sociology of citizenship, through the sociology of Talbot Parsons, of course, who has simplified Weber's interpretation even more in having the development of citizenship as a transition from societies based on ascribed characteristics to societies based on achieved characteristics, and further on with Brian Turner. Now, beyond Weberian approaches, or Weber's own approach, these kinds of analyses have not at all concentrated on the global level. They have stayed on the nation level or nation-state level, looking at how the kinds of inequalities have been played out in that context. If you look at the global level, some analyses have been done that, and have actually concentrated on the way the allotment of citizenship levels ethnic differences or not at a global level. In recent analysis, for instance by Aikins, have focused on how birthright citizenship, whether under the jus soli or the jus sanguinis principle, functions as a kind of inherited property that restricts membership in well-off polities to a small part of the world population. So it doesn't matter whether you have to prove blood ties or you are born to a certain territory. What counts is that the right to citizenship is allotted at birth. So it is not achieved. It has been ascribed to you whether you have done anything to deserve it or not. And Shahar has a fascinating analysis where she proves how this institution of citizenship that we deem to be so modern is actually the same kind of feudal entail, the transmission of property from father to son in, yes, European feudalism, but then European feudalism is not the basis for the birth of a modern institution of citizenship that is also equalitarian, as Weber would have it, but it is the transmission of the same kind of ascribed inequalities, this time in terms of the global level. And some other people like Roberto Korzeniewicz and Tim Moran have shown how the minute we look at the global stratification of income, the possession of citizenship of a well-off polity is what actually accounts for your position on that global citizenship. So it's not the education that you can attain, it's not what you can do for yourself in the job market, it's not even the economic growth of the country you live in. What you can do in order to better your position in terms of income at a global level is move to a country with a better citizenship, whether you acquire that or not. Coming to an end, although the low levels of inequality in the West have come to be perceived as structured around achieved characteristics, such as the level of education or the professional position, their long-term stability has nevertheless been safeguarded by restricting the physical access to these regions on the basis of ascribed categories, especially national identity and citizenship, through the control of immigration flows. How do we prevent people from achieving citizenship, from achieving a better status? We close off the club to which they may belong. You may not belong to the club with the citizenship of a well-off polity. Against this background, the ascribed characteristics of nationhood and citizenship become as important for global stratification as class, which is usually considered to depend on levels of achievement. But while class membership has regulated the differential access to resources at the level of national populations, citizenship, that is nation-state membership, has restricted both the mobility and the access to resources of the poorest segments of the population of the world for much of the 20th century, so after the institutionalization of citizenship as part of nation states. So what we have is an increasing commodification of citizenship that additionally attests to the character of inherited property that birthright citizenship acquired in modernity, which means we have strategies that people develop in order to gain access to this good as if it were material property. We have people forging their genealogies, trying to prove the false ancestry to a neighbor country in order to gain, for instance, access to the European Union. And you would have that with the case of Moldavia and Romania. Romania is part of the European Union, Moldavia is not. You have people in Moldavia trying to prove that their ancestors, their grandparents were actually Romanian, and if they receive Romanian citizenship, they can move to Romania or at least acquire EU membership. In the case of the citizenship acquired by territorial right, you have the phenomenon of the anchor babies in the US, where you would have pregnant women trying to cross the border to the US shortly before giving birth, so that they would give birth in the country that gives citizenship to their baby, although it does not give citizenship to their mothers. And the phenomenon has been called anchor babies. Now, this proves that we have actually the same kind of birthright citizenship functioning as an ascribed category that people try to somehow issue, but that is actually no way of proving any kind of modern characteristic to citizenship, and it is not a means of achieving political equality other than for the people contained in the same exclusive West that Weber has posited as unique. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this inspiring paper. I would like to proceed with the next speaker. Oh, yeah, I think we have to move.
Yeah.
Noémi Michel is a PhD student in political science at the University of Geneva. Her PhD dissertation addresses issues of racialized symbolic politics in post-colonial Europe. To keep it short, Noémi, as you insisted on, since discussions on race and post-coloniality remain very marginal in Swiss social sciences, she co-founded with Manuela a research group named Thinking Post-Colonial and Racial Difference, in order to generate collective reflections on these topics.
Thank you, Cengiz. I don't know if you can hear me. Thank you very much to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. So the title of my talk is Visual Politics of Invisible Racism, the controversy over the black sheep poster in Swiss cities. In this talk, I would like to address the figuration of the European city with help of the notion of racelessness. Through the concept of racelessness, the critical race theorist David Theobald seeks to make sense of racial regimes and racist logic in post-war Western Europe. Racelessness consists of a specific discursive configuration, namely the absence of explicit racial references in public discourses combined with the persistence of racism. So in the book The Racial State, Goldberg says, for instance, the forms of racelessness, colorblindness, racial democracy, ethnic pluralism, state multiculturalism become the public naming of racial reference, a way of speaking about racial conditions in the face of their unnameability or formal unspeakability. In so naming, one is at once claiming racial conditions as unspeakable and yet spoken for, unmentionable and yet spoken to, non-referenced and yet spoken about. I propose that we think of racelessness as a logic that governs not only what we can say or not say, what can be named or unnamed, but also what can be visible or invisible in the public space. I aim to question the figuration of the European city. I aim to question how the figuration of the European city is powerfully, yet invisibly, racialized. And I propose to explore this question in the specific context of the Swiss city of Geneva during the so-called controversy over the black sheep poster. So in 2007, the Schweizerische Volkspartei, meaning the Swiss People's Party, usually called the SVP, a powerful populist right-wing party in Switzerland, produced this poster. Okay, so the poster includes the slogan for more security, accompanied by the image of several white sheep in a field composed of the colors of the Swiss flag, and one of the white sheep kicks a black sheep out of the Swiss territory. So this poster supported the SVP's campaign for the election of the Swiss National Assembly, as well as the SVP's campaign to collect signatures for initiating a law that would legalize the automatic expulsion of foreigners convicted with crime. The SVP displayed about 10,000 posters on the walls of the Swiss city. And it also produced derived visual objects allowing bodies to become political advertisements. So these are ties. So you could just go on the website of the SVP and buy some ties and advertise for the white sheep and the black sheep. So this is an example. There were a lot of derived products. And it is important to note, to give some information about the discursive context, the broader discursive context of this poster, it is important to note that since the 90s, the SVP claims for the limitation of foreigners in Switzerland. It campaigns the campaigns of the SVP systematically associate foreignerness with criminality and with danger for the Swiss national identity, and the campaign of the SVP systematically draw on implicit racial references. However, when it displayed this poster, the SVP kept saying that the poster was referring to the common expression the black sheep of the family, which is translingual, and that it had nothing to do with race. The poster, nevertheless, became the object of broad controversy, whose expression could be found on the walls and on the bodies. So counter graffitis and posters appeared everywhere in Swiss public spaces. So here you can see the security has been crossed, and it's for more racism. And also counter accessories were circulating. So these are examples of badges with colored sheep that people would wear to manifest that they were against the poster. So given the ambiguity of the content of the poster and given the high contention that it produced, the controversy lends itself to be analyzed as a process of renegotiation, production, and reassertion of visual politics of racelessness. And I just analyzed the corpus of public claims that were expressed against or in defense of the controversial poster in Geneva. And in Geneva, the controversy lasted from July to December 2007. On the basis of this analysis, I want to account for the reproduction of a visual regime of racelessness in Geneva in two steps. First, I want to expose how the controversy over the black sheep poster consisted of three competing sets of claims, forming three diverging discourses about visual figurations of blackness, Swissness, whiteness, and foreignerness in the public space. And second, I suggest that the contentious interplay between these three discourses produced a renewed regime of visual racelessness and facilitated the production of raceless and invisible racism. So let me turn now to the three competing discourses that form this controversy. So the first discourse, I called it the discourse of anti-racism. So this discourse was expressed by anti-racist collectives, by associations of black people, by representatives of the United Nations, by far left-wing political parties and officials. So these various actors demanded the government of Geneva to ban the poster. They justified this demand by claiming that the content of the poster was overtly racist, that it performed an exclusion on a racial basis, and the poster thus was accused to violate the Swiss anti-discrimination law. So for instance, an association defending the rights of black people in Switzerland declared the following: the SVP promotes an image that generates racial hate by associating black skin color with insecurity in Switzerland. Through such an exclusion, how can the black minority of Switzerland consider itself as fully Swiss? Should the Swiss multiculturalism be characterized by phenotypic whiteness? So this excerpt illustrates how the discourse of anti-racism seeks to disarticulate, First, this discourse asked for the figuration of blackness into Swissness, because it explicitly enunciates the term blacks and black minority, and it calls for the inclusion of the black subjects among the Swiss residents that have to be protected by the law. But this excerpt also illustrates how this discourse seeks to disarticulate whiteness from Swissness. It explicitly, and this is very rare in the Swiss context, it explicitly enunciates the term whiteness and deplores that Swiss identity is exclusively conceived as white. So in sum, the discourse of anti-racism pursues the double aim to name racism by mobilizing explicit racial references and to combat racism through the concrete demand of banning the racist poster. It seeks to impose a visual regime that admits the figuration of race and of racialized people in order to unfigure visual representations that are racist. However, Geneva's government rejected the demand of banning the poster. So the majority of Geneva, of the government of the local authority, justified this rejection on the basis of a second set of claims, forming a discourse that I called the discourse of anti-exclusion, to which I turn now. So Geneva's governmental majority, together with a broad coalition of civic associations and left and right-wing local political parties, claimed that instead of banning the poster, Geneva should officially reassert its commitment against exclusion. On the basis of this discourse, the government initiated the campaign Vivre Ensemble, meaning living together, consisting in the display of these two counter posters. I'm going to go back to this poster. And so during the local assembly debate, a right-wing local assembly member declared, for instance, the following: Geneva should condemn any politics of exclusion. Geneva has been constructed thanks to the contribution of foreigners, and especially 4 centuries ago, thanks to the contribution of Protestant migrants persecuted by the French king. So this excerpt and this counter posters illustrate well how the discourse of anti-exclusion seeks to impose a specific meaning of Swissness. It seeks to re-articulate Swissness to values such as openness, humanism, or pluralism. And as you can see in this counter poster, like all these sheep, the 24 sheep are supposed to symbolize the rich plurality of the Switzerland as a federal country, so all the regions. So the discourse of anti-exclusion seeks to also to re-articulate foreignerness with Swissness. However, this foreignerness is never expressed nor figured through racial terms. Foreignerness is evoked through terms and visual representations that refer to minorities or part of the population. So for instance, as we have seen in this excerpt, the useful foreigners, the foreigners are these Protestant migrants of 4 centuries ago, so I think that we can well assume that these are white foreigners, even if it's not explicitly said. I'm not going to detail the third discourse, which is the Swiss People's Party trying to defend their vision of Swissness and defend the poster. Let me just mention that the SVP strongly reacted to the counter-campaign initiated by the government of Geneva. And so the SVP tried to reassert, to reconnect foreignerness with criminality and danger, and to call for a better protection of Geneva's border. So now in the second step of my analysis, I would like to say more about the power dynamics, the interplay between the 3 discourses that I just presented. According to my analysis, this interplay can be described as a collaboration between 2 of these discourses against the third. The discourse of anti-exclusion and the discourse of the SVP, they are supposed to combat each other. They're supposed to be political opposites. But actually they work together to silence the discourse of anti-racism. These 2 discourses mutually reinforce each other in 2 ways. First, they contribute to block anti-racism's attempt to re-articulate blackness into Swissness. As seen before, the discourse of anti-exclusion promotes a definition of foreignerness, mainly conceived in abstract terms and through abstract visual representations that remain very evasive regarding race. Through such a racial evasiveness, as Goldberg would say, the discourse of anti-exclusion does not seek to include blackness into Swissness, nor does it explicitly disconnect blackness from danger and criminality. So it does leave space for the SVP's construction and visual representations of otherness that draw on implicit racial references. Second, these 2 discourses work together to block anti-racism's attempt to disarticulate whiteness from Swissness by question of the relation of Switzerland to its foreigners. These two discourses marginalize the discussion on race and racism, and thus block the attempt of the discourse of anti-racism to subvert and deconstruct implicit racialized understanding of Swissness. So these two discourses marginalize anti-racists' call for the figuration of black subjects among Swiss subjects. In sum, these two discourses collaborate together in producing a hegemonic configuration that corresponds to a visual regime of racelessness. The black sheep poster controversy produced a renewed visual form of racelessness that I propose to call sheepology. And sheepology has powerfully influenced the way race and racism can be addressed and visually represented in Swiss public debates until now. The controversy over the black sheep poster has resulted in re-visualizing, in renaming race under the side of the sheep. Indeed, since 2007, the sheep has become a new and a very trendy signifier for race all over Switzerland. It allows anyone to evoke race without explicitly mentioning it or visually representing it. So the SVP has continued to use sheep in its various political campaigns. Here you can see more recent, last year poster, which is saying, you fuck Switzerland, you're out. Literally. That's one of the last poster. And you can see here a teddy bear with a t-shirt with the black sheep poster, so for children. So this is the SVP. It has just capitalized on this image. But also opponents to the SVP, supposed advocates for anti-racism, mobilize the figure of the sheep as a sign of their struggle. This is a logo, this is the United Black Sheep. This is a local far left-wing party that has formed in 2009, I think, in Geneva, and is using the sheep and the image of the sheep as a logo and as a name. And here, this is the cover of a book, kind of called von Schaffen, which is a book from the former president of the Federal Commission Against Racism, who is also mobilizing the image of the sheep in order to talk about racism. So I would furthermore suggest that this sheepology strikingly exemplifies the intersections between codes of visual racelessness and codes of global consumerism and capitalism. The sheep is cute and funny. It is simple. It can even be manipulated and understood by children. The sheep can be easily commodified and can circulate through various derived products, capitalizing on the success of the initial poster and thus addressing numerous people. The sheep can be appropriated by diverging political projects. As we see here, the sheep fits in the discourse of the SVP, but also in the discourse of pluralist, multicolor Switzerland, color being not understood in terms of race. Through this intense and diffuse reproduction and circulation, even on transnational level, because the black sheep poster has been translated by numerous political parties in Europe, the image of the sheep has acquired power to interpolate and to tell stories about race without any explicit reference to race. So to conclude, I would like to ask the question, what is the effect of this evaporation of race under the sign of the sheep? I would like to suggest that this renaming of race powerfully contributes to the invisibilization of racism. The reference to race by means of the sheep narrows the possibility for addressing and redressing racism. It blurs any coherent and critical understanding of ongoing racist logics in Switzerland. The association of race with a sheep hinders the association of current racism with the history of the Swiss city's involvement in colonialism. This is, I'm not sure you can see it well, I'm sorry for the quality of the image, but this is a poster advertising the quote-unquote nigger village in the national exhibition, the Swiss national exhibition that took place in Geneva in 1896. So my question is now, how is it possible to understand the enduring effect of such racial representations and a spatial arrangement that took place not so long ago? How is it possible to address this history under a regime of sheepology? Moreover, under a regime of sheepology, how is it possible for Swiss black people to publicly name themselves? That is, to have a public figure. Sheepology unfigures racialized people of Switzerland and thus narrows their possibility to raise public awareness and intelligibility about their everyday experiences of racism in Switzerland. Okay, I thank you.
Wow, I think I can't. Can someone maybe put the light on? Or do you have another? Okay, let's just continue with the same light constellation. Noémi, thank you very much for this really exciting paper. I think our next paper is also very exciting with a lot of facts, and this time it's going to be about the city we are in now, the city of Berlin. Let me briefly introduce you Kwesi. Kwesi is a political scientist and PhD candidate at the Bielefeld Graduate School in History and Sociology. He studied at the Free University of Berlin and University of Ghana. His research interests include the interaction between Western style and indigenous political institutions in Ghana, post and decolonial perspectives on development, cultural and political representation of the African diaspora, coloniality, and the politics of memory in Germany, as well as critical whiteness studies. As a member of the Initiative Schwarze Menschen in Deutschland, initiative of black people in Germany, as well as the Straßeninitiative, he is involved in the ongoing struggle for a decolonial naming of Berlin streets and a shift from colonial to anti- and decolonial commemoration in and beyond the German capital. For us, yours.
Thank you, Cengiz, for the introduction. And I'd also like to thank the organizers for having put together what I think is not just an academic conference, but more importantly a space where we can apply some of our analysis. So I'm really happy to be here. And what I'll share with you now is called the indelible imprint. I will speak about coloniality and its contestations in contemporary Berlin. So there will be a little historical fact, but I will omit lengthy historical explanations and talk about contemporary issues and struggles. It will be a lot of small glimpses at different struggles, and I invite you to maybe few questions for the discussion. Then I could also delve deeper into some of the historical background if need be. So this is what I will talk about. It's about Berlin, and I have mapped a few sites of struggle. I will be talking about 3 different time periods that are inscribed into the cityscape. It will be about the Brandenburgian involvement in the transatlantic enslavement enterprise. I will also talk about the later period of official Deutsches Reich, German Reich colonialism, and also about the ways in which the Third Reich then harkened back to incite colonial nostalgia. All of these things are inscribed into the very cityscape of Berlin, and I will look at some of these traces. So as I said, it's about 3 different periods of history, just briefly to show you which parts of the world have been touched and also scathed at times by aggression that emanated from Germany and that was orchestrated right here in Berlin. So we see the red dots representing the places where Brandenburgians went to engage in deportation of Africans, and then the blue spaces represent the places that were subjected to aggression by Yes, so it's obvious aggression went out from the city, touched these spaces, and people also came here, were brought here through this aggression, some of them as enslaved people, some of them as prisoners of war, and I think it's very obvious, also in local history, that Weber's dictum certainly did not include these people, because they were brought here to be imprisoned, to be enslaved for life. Now, I want to move on to the first site that I want to investigate, which is the African Quarter, Afrikanisches Viertel in Berlin, Wedding. As you see from the red and the yellow spikes coming in, this is a place where both the Second Reich, Colonial Reich, inscribed colonial ambitions, and where later the Third Reich also, continued this tradition. So it's a giant ensemble of colonial commemoration. And if we look a little more closely at the years in which some of these names have been given, we see that it ranges all the way from 1899 to 1939, and actually the 1950s. So it is really a place where we can see how colonial commemoration has been performed and re-inscribed over generations in a way that I think was very formative. It was not just to the quarter, but to the whole idea of what Berlin is all about. I have another map here where I marked all the streets in the quarter that have colonial connotations. As you can see, they are very many. There are 24 in all. And then there are 4 allotment gardens, which also have colonial names. Some of these streets just commemorate spaces and places where Germans went to perpetrate their aggression. Some of it sounds very benign, like Kameruner Straße, but if you look at the time when the names have been given, you see it's a direct reference to colonial aggression that went on there. You see 3 streets, or 2 streets in 1 square that are marked in red. These are streets that honor colonial perpetrators. Being Peters, Nachtigall, and Rüderitz. And in marking them, I'm already foreshadowing some of the activist work that I want to talk about, which is the work of the Straßeninitiative, Street Initiative, that was formed, if I remember well, in late 2006 or early 2007. We got together to build on previous efforts. I mean, there has been a long run of critique of some of these spaces and ways of colonial commemoration, but we wanted to put together different kinds of skill sets and support each other's efforts. So we set out to research more than 70 street names across the city with colonial connotations. And of these, we argued in a publication, we put out a dossier where we listed the results of our research. We argued that 12 of them would have to be renamed immediately. We said all of them have to be marked and explained, but we argued that something like Kameruner Straße might not be in need of renaming, only of critical comment. However, we said that 12 of these streets honor colonial perpetrators or reinscribe racist language, so they really have to go. And 3 of them were marked in the map you just saw. So, yes, our main aim in all this was to ensure that Berlin's and Germany's all too often unacknowledged colonial past and present are not erased. So the point of the renaming was not to say it should just go. Rather, we set out to shift the perspective of commemoration. The idea was to move on from what we read as colonial commemoration to a critical anti-decolonial stance in which not the people who have been, committing the violence should be honored, but rather the people who have been doing the resistance, be it here or be it in the spaces that have suffered under this aggression. So I want to take you on a brief walk around African Quarter. Here we see this entrance to a place of where you can find a lot of allotment gardens. and in German this is called Dauerkolonie Togo, which translates as permanent colony of Togo. Of course, Togo being one of the places that had been occupied by Germans at one point. If we move in and we look around, we find actually the trace of what this name actually represents. It represents Third Reich propaganda, which is alive and well and active in this name until this very day. Because if you look here, you see that it says, Allotment Garden Association Togo, and then it says founded in 1939, which is of course long after Germany had to relinquish its authority over Togo. But it is not coincidentally the year when the Third Reich embarked on another set of aggression, opening the European theater of the Second World War. So this is really about the Third Reich inciting colonial nostalgia to reinscribe and further its own imperial aims, which included, but were not limited to, regaining colonies. This is a picture that was taken a few weeks ago, right there in this allotment, where you find people flying on top. You see the Imperial War flag, the nice Kriegsflagge, which has been used both during the colonial era and also later during the Third Reich. The lower flag, you can't see it because of the way the wind reshapes it, but underneath the cross is the year 1914, which is of course the year of the outbreak of the First World War, which led to Germany losing its colonies. So we see how this space, right to this very day, gives room to actually perform this imperial nostalgia. If we step out of this allotment, we come across this street, Petersallee, which I just want to briefly reference because in my mind it is paradigmatic for the way in which Germany deals with its colonial past, in Berlin and in other places. Petersallee was also named in the same year, 1939, so it's another remnant of National Socialist propaganda. Peters was one of the most gruesome German colonial perpetrators. So in the 80s, people who lived in the street began to criticize the name and said, this is unbearable, the name should go. And then what happened was that the street was not really renamed, but simply, as you see above, rededicated. It should now commemorate a certain Professor Dr. Hans Peters, fairly unknown until that point, a mild critic of the Third Reich. Now, different opinions on this. My opinion is that this is certainly not enough, because Petersallee is still right in the middle of this giant ensemble of colonial commemoration. It crosses through Nachtigall Square, one of his colleagues in what I would call crime, and it's surrounded by street names which commemorate the places where he perpetrated his violence. So even with very fleeting knowledge, it's very, very clear who is commemorated, even if you put another name plaquette up there. Tellingly, this is the only explanatory plaquette in the whole quarter. Now, our activism extended to this quarter. We've been criticizing this. We said, like I said, the name has to go. And here you see the political reaction. In the last elections, the CDU, Christian Democratic Union, a conservative party, actually took it upon themselves to run an election campaign by speaking out against having streets in African Quarter renamed. The beauty of this is that the overall election slogan of the CDU for Berlin was that people should vote CDU for a change, right? Vote CDU for a change, and then here you have, don't change any street names in African Quarter, right? So much for this, the notion of change in this election. I want to move, in the interest of time, I want to move further south to Wilhelmstraße, which is in Berlin Mitte, which is the site of two traces that I want to talk about. One is the old address of Wilhelmstraße, where the Reichskanzlerpalais was located. The building doesn't exist anymore, but this is the place where Bismarck invited colonial powers to carve up and divide Africa in the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. And what you see here is a commemoratorial plaquette that was not erected by the city, but by a group of activists who came together, lobbied, organized, and raised the money to put this plaquette there. What you need to know is that the whole street is full of official commemoration of Second World War edifices, because of course the Reichskanzlerpalais was also a residence of Adolf Hitler, but they didn't find it necessary to extend the commemoration to this. However, of course, we all know the Berlin Conference is of relevance for African and diasporan realities to this very day, which is exemplified in this placard, which was part of the a drive to mobilize towards protesting the G8 meeting in Heiligendamm in 2007. So there was a campaign of placards all around the country, and this was one of them, created by Senegalese Berlin artist whose work is under the rubric of Laboratoire d'Urbanisation. Excuse my French, I don't pronounce it well, I'm sure, but the idea I find very enduring. I found this placard very empowering because it points to a future where we are de-Berlinizing ourselves as people of African descent, where we recognize that Berlin is a symbol for colonial division, and where we move beyond, step out of the division and of the exploitation that is enabled through this division to this very day. Quickly moving on, if you walk a few meters from this, you will get to the subway station of Mohrenstraße, which commemorates the deportation of enslaved Africans by Brandenburgians to this very place, which at that time was just outside the city wall. So this is where enslaved Africans were kept. They were forced to serve as musicians in the court's army. They were also made to serve as well, serfs in the court itself. So hence the name, Mohrenstraße. What you see here is another way in which the layers of history in Berlin sometimes lead to surprising results, because the street has been named Mohrenstraße for a very long time, but not this subway station. When it was opened in the 20s, it was opened as Kaiserhof, Emperor's Court. It became part of the Soviet-occupied zone after the Second World War. And of course, the Soviets were not in for any feudalist commemoration, so the emperor had to go. They renamed it to Ernst Thälmannplatz, Ernst Thälmann being a communist songwriter. Somehow in the 80s, Thälmann fell out of grace, and they changed the name to Otto Grotewohlstraße. Otto Grotewohl being a member of the Central Committee of the GDR. Now, when the war came down, a few years after the renaming, of course, Otto Grotewohl had to go. And then Germans reached very, very deep into the, whatever you name it, of history, and pulled up this name, which connotes colonial racism, which connotes enslavement, degradation, and deportation of Africans. And as you can see, people began to intervene into this fairly quickly, and this is hard to translate in German. More is one word, and if you put these little umlaut, it becomes something entirely different. Möhrenstraße means something like Carrot Street. So an easy way to conduct a renaming, which is being done repeatedly by activists. For example, this from the media, a group calling themselves Autonomous Rabbits. They did not only, put the carrots there, but also importantly leaflets on which they explain, the history that I just alluded to, and call on passers-by and residents to change, to lobby for change. Now, my time is almost up. Okay, I'll try to make it very brief. Now, this aspect of history is much neglected in Germany, but there's one place in Berlin where the enslavement enterprise is actually remembered, which is the German Technical Museum. Mind you, not the German Historical Museum, which is also in the city, but the German Technical Museum. So the question that is being asked is, what have we done with our ships? Well, one of the things is apparently enslavement. And let me just, without further ado, show you how this is being depicted in that museum. Yes, I see, your mouths are agape. It is really something that I would say that I cannot think of any other Holocaust that is, represented or commemorated in this fashion. So there is a dark room. You are invited to bring light, a light into a dark chapter of German history. You press a button, and then in a flash of light, you see this life-size puppets, which are supposed to represent, enslaved Africans being deported. Recently, we staged an intervention there. Did a guided tour, invited the responsible person, and had a long discussion about the many, many reasons why this is totally unacceptable. After which she indeed did say that yes, she understands that this is a mistake, and after this being there for I think 12 years, she has agreed to reshape this exhibition as soon as she has time, which she explained to us would be not before 2014. But since now we have a foot in the door, we hope to do something about this pretty soon. Lastly, I will skip this now, the history of Guerrero and Nama, to in the last minute briefly talk about the success that we did have with this dossier that I mentioned in the beginning. Sweden Initiative has been putting together all these names that have to change, and one of them was also connected to the Brandenburgian enslavement enterprise, which is the name of von der Gröben, who was commandeering the fleet that went to the shores of today's Ghana to erect the castle or the fort that was used for enslavement. And he was honored with Gröbenufer at the shores of the Spree. We said name has to go, and after a very, very long, I think 2.5 year lobbying campaign, we were successful. The street was indeed renamed to Manuela. In doing so, the local parliament followed our demand to shift the perspective of commemoration by renaming Gröbenufer after a very important founding member of the Afro-German movement, Maya Yim, a poet, a scientist who in all her work also criticized the continuity from colonial racism to Third Reich racism to present-day racism, and also pointed out that this all is also inscribed into the Berlin cityscape. So I think it's a very worthy successor. Last thing, very importantly for us, it's not about renaming the street. You see in the corner there a plaquette which in German and in English details not just who Manuela was, but also after whom the street was named before, what the history is about, and what the shift in perspective is supposed, to signify and entail. So this is not about erasing history; it's about shifting the perspective. And this is also what I hope to say for the future. I do think that remembering differently can reshape the present and is a prerequisite for decolonization and for a decolonial future. As we move on in our activism, we are also attempting to shift our own agenda a bit from merely deconstructing these things ourselves to reaching out to the people whose lives have actually been touched in these different spaces and invite them to also contribute, for example, suggestions for name patrons. And lastly, what I would like to say is these things have a profound effect also on the way people move in space, people occupy space, people utilize space. My Ufer is now a preferred venue where different organizations from the Black community have manifested cultural and political programs, so it is indeed a space where new things become visible. I'll leave it at that. My time is more than spent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. I feel very privileged to moderate such a fantastic panel, and we're not finished yet. So I'm quite confident that a lot of you cannot wait to give their comments and to ask their questions. However, I would like to observation for the panelists. So I would like to go back to Manuela's paper. On a certain moment, Manuela, you were speaking about the singularity of the West, that the Weber's whole earth is about to prove the singularity of the West. Connecting that actually with our first speaker's paper today, Ella Shoat, it really recalled me the parallels or the pendant of the singularity of the Holocaust. So I think it seems like we are moving still on the same paradigm. I'm just wondering whether you would like to give a comment on that. I think that's not accidental, to put it that way. Weber is using an Orientalist frame. When I was reading your paper yesterday, I was very excited, but all the time I was asking, like, why did Edward Said not analyze Weber? So, I mean, there's a lot of Orientalism in there. So that my question would be, are we speaking about the Saidian Orientalism, or what kind of Orientalism do we deal with, do we face here in the Weberian context? And what is also very striking with Weber is apparently that blackness has no place at all. That, or maybe there is a place, maybe you omitted it, but it seems like the Orientalist frame per se excludes the African identity, the Africanism as such, which reminds me actually to Hegel's whole imaginary of Africa as such. And I think I have some other comments as well, but I don't want to go too detailed. A last thing would be, and that would be also at the same time a question for all the panelists, namely, can you make your argument, make your observations more intersectional? So what has intersectional? What's the place, state of gender in the whole of Weberian narrative? Not only gender, but also other categories of inequality. Coming back to Noémi's paper, you gave us a lot of empirical evidence. My question is, I think that's probably because that's my favorite topic at this moment. You made a lot of reference to the word of race. And I belong to one of these few people here in the German context who are explicitly making a strong point to use race as a social construction, because there is a movement to eradicate race from the German Basic Law. And as a lawyer, I said, no, that's not the way we should go. We should have a critical approach to race, but we need of, or the zonification of black, you ended up with the picture. And I think maybe we should also come back to this. What does that say about coloniality, about the continuity of colonial discourses as such in Geneva and in Berlin? And I mean also, yeah, maybe I should keep it there. I think that's a lot to maybe comment or answer, and I promise you I will also give you the word. Just pick up a question or yeah, please.
Thank you so much for all the comments. It's great that you also go back to the idea of singularity and yes, the singularity of the West and the singularity of the Holocaust seen in parallel. It doesn't have to be this phenomenon or this West that we talk about. Any kind of construction of singularity shows also not the fact that everything else doesn't matter, but also what Ella said this morning, there are no connections. Constructing something as singular, as unique, means there's no connection to anything else. So in order for Weber to do that, to say that the West is unique and that only there citizenship has been constructed, he has to trace citizenship back to ancient Greece. He has to go back, in fact, 1,000 years, erasing a whole history of connections and erasing all kinds of connections between Western cities and other cities, and the development of science through the Arab world, and the exclusion of the Jews and the Moors from modernity in order for modernity to become modern. So, of course, this is connected with the Holocaust because this was before, it was the prehistory of the Holocaust. It had to do with the prehistory of the West becoming unique. In order for something to be unique, you have to write 3 volumes arguing why it had no connections with anything else. And that's what it does. And in terms of, I think it's the connection is better with blackness directly, and then I'll go to the Said part. I didn't get into that. Weber did speak about blackness in a way that very much reminds me of the discussion we had today about, also with Ella's talk, with race and racism and discussions about race being like an American phenomenon that is being exported now. Weber had the same issue, but his race issue was with Polish workers, and especially Eastern Europeans working in Germany. Now, he didn't want to address that in terms of race, but he explicitly denies German nationality and German values, cultural values to Polish workers in very racial terms, blatant racial terms. Now, when he talks to WEBD Plus and publishes an article by Du Bois in the Archiv für Sozialwissenschaft, he says, just like Du Bois, the problem of the next century is going to be the problem of the colorblind. And look at the Americas, look at this scholar, who's the most incredible scholar that this century has produced. But for that context, not for our context. There's a complete disconnection in saying the race issue, oh, it's their issue, and he deals with it great. Now, what we have here is the problem of the labor force. And this labor force, the Poles, they're, unfortunately, they work under such low standards that our cultural standards would have to be lowered as well in order for us to compete with them. So he explicitly denies any kind of biological racism in construction of race, in talking about blackness and in talking about the American context, but he uses very biologistic arguments when talking about his own context. So the connection is there, but it's actually very perverse, right? Because the way he talks about things where he acknowledges the existence of race actually makes it possible for him to emphasize that there is race somewhere else, but not where he's talking about. So, yeah, is that Said's Orientalism? Well, Said talks about 2 kinds of Orientalism, the latent and the manifest. He says Marx has a kind of latent Orientalism that preserves the passivity of the Orient and its femininity and its malleability. Yes, I think it's a kind of latent Orientalism. I think in Said's work, the manifest Orientalism, the one that sent in the troops to conquer the Orient, was the most dangerous one. I think the latent one is the most dangerous one. Because it sounds benign, and it sounds like it is an other. But by instituting this lack as something that has to be tolerated, it is being also solidified. It's like this kind of lack, this passivity, this femininity of the Orient is not to be done away with. It's always going to be there. And the way this also functions in a perverse way is that people who have engaged with Weber's analysis of citizenship and the city try to argue that that the Asian city and some Arab cities and some American cities have been Occidental in the same way as Weber does. So instead of saying, no, nationality is something else, modernity is more than just what happened in the West, they try to argue and to revalue their own cities and their own culture by talking in terms that Weber used as normative. So I think that's more perverse than.
What is the gender of the sheep? Yes, sheepology is gender, but it's kind of complicated. I try to answer by utilizing three empirical examples. I didn't show here, like I was illustrating the anti-exclusion discourse, and I didn't show the only, so then I claimed that the anti-exclusion discourse, that was a hegemonic discourse during this controversy, did not refer to blackness. Actually, there was one production of visual representation of blackness. It was a virtual poster, so it was circulating on the web, but it was virally circulating. And this poster was representing Beyoncé. So I don't know if you know her, an African-American pop singer. And Beyoncé, like, in a very sexy outfit. Actually, not enough. She was naked. And the body of a black male without a hat. So just a very muscular torso, yeah. And so the message was, do you want to chase the black sheep? We don't want to. So here we see that sheepology is sexualized, meaning that the only representation of blackness that were mobilized here were representation of blacks as objects, as sexual objects, objects of desire. So this is, for me, the way of erasing or evaporating race through another sign is a way of actually letting space for production of this kind of sexualized blackness. So this is one example. The second example is that some years after the black sheep, the first black sheep controversy, the same government of Geneva had to debate about another case of posters. It was about sexist posters. And the same government that said, no, we don't have to forbid the black sheep poster, actually decided to prohibit two sexist advertising that would be too sexist in the surroundings of schools. So that means that actually sexist images, like children, have to be protected by sexist images, but not by racist images. And I can say that the black sheep poster was really understood by children, and there was a documentary film about how children reacted to this poster and how children were afraid. Some children just ran home when they saw the poster, children with black parents, and they were just afraid that their parents would be expulsed. So the poster is interpolating children, but children, like the Geneva's authorities, did not decide that children doesn't have to be protected. But we see how sexism can be sometimes mobilized in order to kind of don't debate about racism. And I think it has also to do with here, because you said intersection, so it has to do with generation and age, and how like racist discourses are interpolating here children, and how they have, I don't know, teddy bears with the black sheep. What does it mean? I don't have, it's just a thought. And just the third example, I think the sheepology has also a class aspect in it, because I was illustrating one of the excerpts with the right-wing deputy saying that foreigners are welcome think the idea behind is that it's useful foreigners that contribute to the economic wealth of Switzerland. And so there is here a class aspect of who is allowed to be inside, someone who contributes to the wealth. So yes, there is intersections there. Thank you for letting me explore, making it more explicit. And the question about race, yes, I use race, race, in the Swiss context, and yes, in my department of political science, I'm the only one. Actually doing research about that and realizing this category, and yes, people were saying to me, no, it's not about race, it's about foreignerness, it's about xenophobia. And so I was, I don't know, I think it's a long story. I just want to say you an anecdote, what I did. I don't know if it's a good idea. What I did was to say, look at me, I'm a Swiss citizen. I mean, I was not born as Swiss, but I'm Swiss. But actually people keep asking me where do I come from, keep sending me back to an exotic place. So I think it has to do with how I look. And I think it has to do with race. I try to, gently remind that actually, yes, on a daily basis, race matters. And so race is a kind of a taboo as a word, but it is in the law. But it's very narrow. The way anti-racism is formulated in the law is it's penalized, it's a panel, and it's individual.
Maybe also to start with the intersectionality, because it gives me a chance to talk a bit more about the strategy that we as Street Initiative deployed, because in terms of gender, we were faced with a very interesting challenge, which is the fact that the German or Berlin bylaws governing the renaming of streets prescribe that if the street is renamed, they have to be renamed after women, because so far the count of women that streets have been named after is woefully low in Berlin, so that should change. And so the law prescribes if you want to rename, it must be a woman, which was very interesting for us to work with, because if you look at colonial history, especially from the more mainstream vantage point, it's of course very often told as a history of men, so European men doing things to other men, and so on and so forth. When we came up with this dossier where we list all street names with their historical connotation, we also developed a list of alternative name patrons, which we did not link to specific streets, but we said, well, these people, movements somehow speak to this history, and this, if you were to rename after them, there would be a shift of perspective, being forced to engage with this and being forced to unearth, the contribution of women to these struggles was, at least to me, very instructive and inspiring, because now I know about, for example, the whole female brigades in the Chinese movement to expel Western colonialists, what's called Boxer rebellion here. But I think it makes a deeper point about how such strictures can also be positive in that they can free us from this narrow masculinist focus of the way history is told, and really come away from his story to our stories. But intersectionality, if I were to expand it a bit more, there's also an issue of space and place, and being positioned to speak and having access. Geographic location was, of course, in the beginning. We mobilized as Berliners, so this was also part of our claim. We are also Berlin. We also have a right to speak. We have a right to remix the way the memory is organized in the city. But over time, as I said also were just to read historic traces right here in this city, that alone could tell us that no, it's not that simple. And this is why I think Berlin is also very important. It can be very instructive as a canvas, if only we empower ourselves to read it differently. Because this, what you see here, the ceremony where Herero and Nama came to repatriate the skulls of their ancestors who had been killed in what was the first German concentration camp, or first set of German concentration camps in Namibia. It's simply showcases certain connection, and if we delve in deeper, again using them as a canvas, we see that these connections were not only ideological, but they were also personal. There were people garnering racist expertise in this conflict through medical experiments in these camps and so on, who then rose to high positions in the Third Reich, again being positioned right here in Berlin, and then somehow having things like the office that determines who's an Aryan. So we see how these connections and sometimes direct and immediate continuities are inscribed in the city. Maybe to get to the point of the question of racelessness. Well, I mean, read as a problematic, I think we can of course say that part of the thing that this activism is criticizing is the fact that Black people might be represented, but in the dominant reading, they're not subjects, right? They're merely objects of other people's schemes and designs. However, I think that could also prompt one to try and read again the city, read the city's history a little differently, and then I think there's a chance to uncover subjectivity, to uncover not just resistance, but simply Black people, African descendants in Berlin, making their way, having their own agency, and even people who were brought in to be objectified. So, for example, there are various people who were brought here as part of the Völkerschau, which I didn't talk about now, which are also very important to trace across the city. And some of these people, Völkerschau were a very brutal display of racialized notions where Africans were forced to perform white fantasies of primitive authenticity. And this was very harsh. People also died. Right here in Victoria Park, people died performing these things, but others survived and were able to stay on, were able to somehow socialize and, for lack of a better word, in quotation marks, somehow integrate in Berlin, and becoming active, for example, becoming outspoken critics of German colonialism, becoming union leaders, and so on. So this is a very fascinating history of agency that you can also uncover from this. And the last point to that, I think racelessness could also be read as an aspiration. However, as problematic as it is, it's also inscribed, and that's part of, I think, the never-ending or unsolvable contradictions within colonialism and racism, that somehow there's this directionality where somehow in colonialism, for example, they are inferior, but they have to be helped to ascend, where then at one point in this colonial imagination, race should be irrelevant, right? So there are all these contradictions that in my mind stem from that as well. And I think if you go back in history and try to look at this, you can also find ways of destabilizing, and I can't quite remember who said it, but I think in Weber, when you talk about Weber, there was this idea that, well, back then they were all like that, right? So somehow it's an excuse. If you're born in a certain time, of course you are racist. And looking at the history of, again, the emanated from the city, I think there are chances to deconstruct this normalization of racism. Just a brief example, looking at enslavement, the history that I talked about, it's very often normalized. People tell me, yeah, but you have to understand, back then it was like that, it was normal. And then, luckily now, I have a source that helps me, and it's very important for me to say that no, it was not normal, not even for quote-unquote ordinary Germans. There's a record of Germans emigrating to the US and encountering enslavement there, and writing a very, very fiery letter to the state authorities in that context, saying, denouncing the practice and saying that as Germans, they don't want to have anything to do with that because they find it, savage, primitive, and unchristian. How is it possible that you would do this to another person just because of the color of their skin? And this was in 1700 something. You see, so if you look at racelessness as an aspiration, I think, and again read the canvas of the city, things that emanated from here, you can also, it helps to deconstruct this naturalization somehow. That's how it looks back.
Wow, thank you very much for this first comment. I also. I am told that, just quick, Noah, is it okay if we really finish 7:20? Or is that critical?
We were told that we need some more time to
Okay.
set up.
Okay,
we need some-
5 more minutes. Is that fair? Or yes? Because I really would like to give the audience this small occasion to give their comments or questions. Please, let's try to keep it short. Yes, 1, 2.
Can we one?
Okay, go, please.
5 minutes?
Yeah,
Would
please.
you like to choose or? I just choose or what? Where the hands?
Yeah.
I'll keep this as short as possible. First of all, thanks a lot for your talks. This has been refreshing in an academic environment that's where post-colonial criticism usually dissolves into some sort of culturalism and doesn't get to critiques of society and race. But my question, very short, to Kwesi, what is the effect that naming has on the people that inhabit these colonial city spaces? What is, well, psychological, but otherwise, I mean, because it's, if you're a queer woman of color living in Berlin and you walk down any one of these streets, I was looking for a flat in Transvaal-Straße and this struck me. You don't, as a subject, you're not represented in this space, and you're, so anyway, that was my question. What is the effect, according to you, that naming has?
The second question? Second, yeah, please.
I actually just wanted to make a comment, if it's okay too. Yeah, I just found it interesting because you were asking about the connections or how the topics somehow are connected, and I just wanted to pick up that Manuela mentioned Weber and the Polish people and racism that he also used towards Polish people, and the topic of the street names and the connection of post-colonialism and post-socialism, because it's also interesting about that many streets are named after the former Polish territories, or now Polish territories, former German territories, and somehow it's also, this history is also covered up somehow, that the whole biggest Jewish European community was killed, and for example Warschauer Straße, that Warsaw was nearly completely destroyed by the Germans and Hitler, and there are also interesting entanglements when you look at this. And also I wanted to mention, for me very important, because we also studied at the Institute of European Anthropology, which is also in Mohrenstraße, and it's like a struggle going on for a long time. But for us as students or former students, really disappointing that nothing has happened from the institute. Yeah.
Okay. First question. First, what is the effect on the people? There is a vocal group in all these streets that say, no, this should not be renamed because we would have a high cost. We have to change our business cards and all these things. And this, it's funny, but it translates into political capital, as you see here. And being at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, I want to mention that it is not only conservative parties who, embrace these voices, but I also know that in your context, Transvaal, the Green Party also went from house to house to say, don't worry, if you elect me, no street will be renamed. And in the context of Kreuzberg, the CDU could happily count on the support of the history is so detached that people, regardless of their political affiliation, can simply sit and say, no, no, you know, of course I'm left, but of course, you know, colonial perpetrators have to be commemorated. That said, there is a vocal minority. Last time I gave a tour, do tours in Wedding, a woman came to me and she just was a passerby and she walked with us. And in one of the breaks she asked me, so when will it change? You know, because I live here for so long and it's so embarrassing, it is so shameful. I really hope that you can tell me when this will change. So there's both, and lastly, political point, if you live there, I can tell you from my experience doing the lobbying, your letter counts. If you tell the local government and you post the letter publicly, maybe on the net, or you share it with Berlin Post-Colonial or whomever, this is political capital that can and will be used in the fight for renaming. So if you are there, make your voice heard.
Thank you very much. One last minute.
Okay. No, just very shortly, thanks a lot also for the comment on the continuities between the different kinds of exclusions, also looking at Eastern Europe and the history with Germany, because many of the stereotypes that are not only present in street names, but also in the kind of cultural racism still being reproduced towards Eastern European Polish people, and especially there's a lot of continuities to be seen there, and could be traced back also to some of the classical sociologists that have put them there in the first place. And that's also part of the discussion that is being erased in sociology. Like, this shameful part is not being discussed, or is being put down to the young Max Weber, or the young Marx, or the young whatever, and the kind of, for instance, the most orientalist articles that Marx and Engels, or that Marx wrote, were considered not to be as important as the rest of his work because they were commissioned, because he didn't write them off his own intent, but because he needed the money. So that's what makes them less academic. And also excusing all kinds of comments that are not politically correct disregards the systematic character of cultural racism in the works of the classics. And the example of the Polish people is blatant, because there's been a big discussion in Poland about that, but it hasn't reached Germany somehow, and it's not so far away.
Thank you very much. I think I have the honor to close this highly insightful, fantastic